Chapter 12. Counterpart. The air shifted first. A thin pressure drop moved across Berik's skin, enough for him to know something had broken the horizon. He did not think. His eyes tracked the glint in the light, a single line of steel pulling the world narrow. The hiss reached him a fraction later. His arm came up, fingers snapped close on the shaft in mid-flight. The wood flexed once in his grip, and the fletching brushed his knuckle. He turned the motion back without breaking stride. The throw was smooth, no wasted power. The bolt vanished into the haze and found the ridge again. A shape jerked there. A man, narrow-shouldered, with the shadow of a crossbow still at his side. The impact took him under the eye. He dropped without a cry, his body collapsing inward before rolling down the sand. Berik was already moving. The wind peeled past him as his boots dug into the slope. The sand gave under each step, but his pace never faltered. His cloak cracked against the gust. There was no hesitation, no human delay. The speed was wrong for a man who had bled out on the relay floor hours ago. His motion had a precision that left no room for stumble. Fenric's voice cut across the breach. Contact. He was already lifting the hammer from the wall, feet grinding grit as he turned. Rina flinched, one hand twitching toward her boot where his spare blade was hidden. Her other hand found the pillar's edge, pressing her into shadow as her eyes scanned for the shooter's partner. The first of them came from the low rise ahead. 3 figures, spread wide, blades ready. The lead man's mask was a strip of stitched leather, his gear worn thin but oiled where it mattered. Berik did not slow. The man brought his blade up to guard, expecting a swing. Berik caught his wrist instead. Bone cracked under the twist. The knife slipped free. Berik stepped in, palm driving into the man's chest just below the collarbone. The force sent him back into the sand with a hollow exhale. He did not rise. A short axe came from the left, cutting across Berik's side. Steel kissed the fabric at his shoulder, but met no more. Berik pivoted inside the arc, knee snapping up into the attacker's ribs. The man folded forward. Berik's elbow came down on the base of his skull, and he dropped limp into the grit. From the right, Fenric broke into the open. The hammer hung two-handed in his grip, its head catching the dim light as he swung low across the slope. A man turned too late to meet him. The hammer caught him at the hip. The sound was wet and metallic at once. The body spun away, legs loose beneath it. Rina stayed low, her back pressed to the half-buried pillar. The wind carried the taste of grit over her tongue. She saw no line she could take without crossing steel. Her eyes stayed on Berik, measuring his movements. They were not the same as they had been days ago, altered now, cleaner, faster. Another came from the rise. His steps were lighter, his stance lower. He led with the point of a long knife, probing for Berik's center line. Berik deflected with the flat of his dagger, turned the man's wrist outward, and cut high across his throat. The man staggered, his weapon falling away as he dropped. The sand shifted again. 2 more shapes, moving faster than the others, broke from the rear line and closed the gap. Berik's boots drove him forward, closing with the first before he could adjust. Their blades met once. Berik's cut slipped the guard and buried in the soft line where shoulder met neck. He yanked the blade free as the second man approached, feinted low, and came up with a slash across the jaw. Blood marked the sand. He turned his head toward the ridge, scanning the angles. The rest were beginning to converge now. 6 still standing, one shape heavier than the rest at the center. The leader, his stance was straight, his blade steady, his eyes locked on Berik from across the sand. The leader did not move yet. He stood at the rear, watching. The others fanned to either side. 4 took the slope on Berik's right, 2 more angled toward Fenric's position near the breach wall. The wind carried a low whistle across the sand, the grit finding every seam in their armor. Berik closed the distance to the right flank before they could lock formation. His dagger punched forward in a straight line, catching the first man high under the arm where the plates gapped. The body lurched sideways into his partner, breaking the man's footing. Berik stepped over the first and cut low at the second's knee. Steel bit through the outer wrap, and the man's leg folded. He went down with a sharp cry that was lost in the wind. The third swung wide, trying to catch Berik on his turn. Berik pivoted just outside the arc. The blade cut empty air. Berik's return was short and fast, the point driven into the man's forearm. The weapon dropped from his hand. Berik followed with a straight kick to the chest, sending him over the sand. On the far side, Fenric advanced with the hammer in both hands. He caught one attacker's swing on the shaft, turned the angle, and brought the head around into the man's ribs. The force drove him sideways into the wall. The next came in low, dagger aimed for Fenric's side. Fenric twisted and caught him across the shoulder with a glancing blow, then pressed forward with a second strike to the hip. The man dropped to a knee, his breath ragged. Rina shifted along the edge of the pillar, her eyes tracking every movement. She saw the opening between the flanks, but stayed where she was, crouched in the shadow. She could still feel the absence of the map thrall systems, the emptiness where the glow and the pull of instructions had been. Without them, she was only her own reflexes. Berik cut through the last man on his side with two quick strikes, the first to turn his blade away, the second to open him across the ribs. The body slumped forward into the sand. Only the leader and two others remained. The pair closed ranks around him, their blades forward, waiting for Berik to come. Fenric stepped clear of the breach wall and began to circle wide, looking to pinch them from the side. The leader glanced his way but made no move to engage. His eyes stayed on Berik, as if the rest of the fight was only prelude. Berik slowed his advance, his steps deliberate now. He kept his weight low, the dagger angled across his body. The wind pushed at his cloak. The leader gave a small signal with his left hand. The two guards broke forward. Berik met the first with a hard bind, his dagger locking against the man's sword. He twisted, pulling the man forward, and drove his knee into the man's stomach. The second came in from the side. Berik turned in time to catch the strike on the back of his blade, then cut low toward the man's shin. Fenric closed in from behind, his hammer catching the second guard high in the shoulder. The man staggered forward, trying to keep his balance, but Berik's blade took him clean across the back of the neck. The first guard, still doubled over, tried to recover. Berik ended it with a straight thrust under the chin. The leader stepped forward at last. The sand between them was already marked with tracks, arcs of steel scored into the grit. The leader's boots stopped just inside striking range. He lifted his blade in a guard that spoke of practice, not habit. The edge caught the last of the light as the sky bled toward dusk. Berik's breathing was steady, but the muscles along his arms and shoulders stayed coiled. His dagger's point angled slightly down, a stance that left no clear opening. They moved first in a slow circle. The wind scraped grit over their boots. Rina leaned out from her cover just far enough to watch. Fenric adjusted his grip on the hammer, ready to close if the chance came. The leader tested, with a short feint at Berik's forward leg. Berik stepped just enough to clear it. His weight did not shift more than needed. Their eyes never left each other's. Another test came from the leader, this one a high cut toward the head that stopped short. Berik's blade had already come up to meet it. No clash, only air. They circled again. The leader's footwork was light for his size. His steps found solid sand, avoiding the loose ridges. Berik mirrored it without thought. He recognized the pattern, the way the man was building rhythm before breaking it. They closed at the same moment. Steel struck steel, a single loud note in the open air. Berik pushed off, breaking the bind before the leader could trap him. The separation was brief. They closed again, blades moving in tighter lines now, the sound sharper, quicker. A low cut came for Berik's thigh. He caught it on the dagger's flat, turned the blade aside, and stepped inside range. The leader's shoulder checked him back, forcing space. Berik let it happen, turning the push into a pivot to face him square again. Rina could see the change in their movement. The cautious testing was gone. They had measured each other and found no advantage. Now each strike carried the weight of intent. The leader stepped in with a cut aimed high at Berik's collar. Berik ducked under it and came up with a rising slash toward the ribs. Steel met steel again, the impact running up his arm. Fenric shifted to keep them both in view, but they moved fast enough that it was hard to track the blade angles from more than a few paces. He kept his hammer ready, waiting for the moment when one of them overreached. The wind dropped for a heartbeat, the air stilling as if holding breath. In that silence, they both moved. The clash was hard enough to drive grit from the ground into the air around them. Berik caught the follow-up strike on his guard, turned it away, and cut low toward the leg. The leader stepped back just in time, the edge missing by less than an inch. They reset again, blades ready. The circling began to tighten, each step pulling them closer until one would have to break. The leader broke first. His weight shifted forward and his blade came in a straight thrust for Berik's chest. Berik angled his dagger to deflect, stepping offline so the steel skimmed past his ribs. He countered with a slash toward the exposed forearm. The leader twisted his grip and caught it on the guard, shoving Berik's blade down and away. They closed again. The tempo quickened. Each strike answered within the breath it took to throw it. Berik pressed with 3 short cuts aimed high, the last turning into a thrust for the throat. The leader slipped to the side, letting it pass close enough to graze the fabric at his collar. Their boots dug deep into the sand now. Every step sent grit sliding underfoot. Berik adjusted without thought, shifting his stance for traction. The leader did the same, never losing balance, even as the slope began to carry them downward. Steel rang against steel. A high bind locked their blades for half a heartbeat. Berik drove forward, trying to overpower him, but the leader stepped back and let the bind break clean. His return was a cut across Berik's midsection. Berik pulled away, the edge slicing through the outer wrap without touching skin. Fenric took 2 steps closer. Eyes on the opening. He saw none. The speed was wrong for him to intervene without risking a swing at the wrong target. Berik shifted tactics. He stepped in low, feinting for the leg, then snapped the dagger upward toward the man's shoulder. The leader caught it and rolled his blade over Berik's to reverse the angle, forcing Berik to turn his wrist hard to keep the steel in hand. They separated, both breathing harder now, though neither's movements slowed. The leader came in with a diagonal cut from high right to low left. Berik met it and stepped into the man's guard, aiming a knee for the ribs. The strike landed solid. The leader grunted but spun with the impact, letting the motion carry his blade toward Berik's head. Berik ducked under it and came back up inside range, stabbing for the side. Steel blocked him again. The slope narrowed here, a drop on one side, where the sand had collapsed into a shallow basin. They fought along its edge, the footing unpredictable. The leader tried to push Berik toward it, forcing his steps back. Berik yielded half the distance, then used the man's next shove to pivot around him, reversing their positions. Rina could see the similarity now. The same bursts of speed, the same precision, even the same habit of breaking a bind before the other could control it. They fought as if drawn from the same pattern. Berik caught the next cut on the inside of his arm guard, slid his dagger along the blade, and tried to trap it. The leader freed it with a sharp twist and came in again, aiming for the gap at Berik's neck. Berik tilted just enough for the edge to miss, then answered with a stab for the abdomen. The hit landed shallow, skimming along leather. The leader's counter was faster, his pommel snapping forward to crack against Berik's temple. The blow made his vision tighten at the edges, but he dropped low and swept for the man's legs. The leader leapt clear, sand spraying as he landed. They circled again, slower for the first time since the fight began. The pause was brief. They charged together, blades striking in a flurry that filled the air with steel and grit. Each step was matched, each cut answered. Neither found an opening worth committing to. Berik's breath came harder now, though his movements stayed sharp. The faint light under his skin pulsed with the rhythm of his strikes. The leader's eyes flicked to it once, then back to Berik's face. It was not a fight either of them could finish here. Their blades locked again, close enough for Berik to see the fine cracks in the man's weapon's guard. The leader's eyes stayed fixed, steady, reading each small shift in Berik's stance. Berik pushed into the bind, trying to drive him back down the slope. The leader held for a moment, then let the pressure go, stepping back to reset his footing. Berik advanced, cutting high, then low, then back to high. All three were caught clean. They broke apart, both breathing hard. The wind moved between them, carrying grit over their boots. The leader's expression did not change, but something in his stance did. It was no longer searching for the win, only holding the line. Berik felt it too. This would end without a kill. They came together one last time, each strike hard enough to throw grit into the air. Berik angled a cut toward the leg, was met, turned it into a thrust for the ribs, was turned aside. The leader swung high. Berik caught it, stepped in, and drove his shoulder forward. They staggered 2 paces before the leader wrenched free. A whistle cut the air from somewhere beyond the ridge. The leader's eyes flicked toward it. His jaw tightened. Berik started forward again, but the man stepped back, then back again, the distance opening fast. He turned, sprinting for the rise. Berik gave chase, boots throwing sand behind him. The leader reached the crest first and disappeared down the far side. Berik crested seconds later, eyes scanning the basin. Empty. The slope beyond was steep, the shadows already deep. Any trail would vanish before they could follow. Fenric came up beside him, hammer resting on his shoulder. He is gone. Berik did not answer. His eyes stayed on the dark below for a long moment before he turned back toward the breach. The wind carried the last trace of footsteps into silence. Berik walked back down the slope without speaking. His boots sank into the sand where bodies had fallen. He knelt beside the first, turning the man onto his back. The mask was leather, worn thin around the straps. A small pouch hung from the belt. Inside, a brass tag no bigger than a coin. The surface was etched with shallow marks, a code or serial, though the edges were worn smooth. Berik turned it once in his hand before tucking it into his belt. Fenric was a few paces away, looking over the ridge where the last two survivors had fled earlier in the fight. He shook his head and came back toward the center. You fought like him. The way you moved. The way you broke the binds. If I hadn't been watching, I wouldn't believe you could do that. Berik opened the next pouch. Only a coil of thin wire and a chipped whetstone. He left them in the sand. If he was the same, then I can find him. Rina stepped from her cover and made her way toward the bodies. Her eyes tracked Berik's movements, the quick way his hands worked through pockets and straps. That speed, she said quietly, wasn't here before. Berik looked up at her. No, it wasn't. She studied him for a moment longer, then knelt by another corpse. There was nothing in the man's satchel but a torn length of cloth, the faded remnants of a guild stamp along one corner. She passed it to Berik without a word. He folded it and added it to his belt. Fenric crossed to a man lying face down in the sand. He rolled him over and found a small water skin and a rusted clasp knife. Both went into his own pack. Berik moved to the last of the fallen, a younger man whose gear was cleaner than the rest. He found a scrap of matte vellum tucked into an inner pocket, most of it worn blank from heat and sweat. A few faint lines and dots were still visible, but without context. He folded it once and slid it inside his cloak. Rina looked out toward the horizon. The sun was already touching the ridge. If you want to track him, we should go now before we lose the light. Berik shook his head. Not tonight. We go back to the other vault. Fenric's tone was flat. To hide? To regroup, Berik said, and to keep what we have out of the open. He will likely not stop looking for me. They made one last pass through the bodies. Berik straightened, scanning the slope. Nothing left to take that would help. The wind was colder now. The sun slipped behind the ridge, shadows stretching long across the basin. Berik started toward the breach without another word. Rina and Fenric followed their boots, leaving shallow prints in the sand that the wind began to erase. The climb back was slow. The day's heat had bled away, leaving the sand cool under their boots. The wind carried only a faint hiss now, enough to keep their tracks soft. No one spoke for the first stretch. Berik kept to the front, his eyes scanning the open expanse ahead. Rina walked a few paces behind, her gaze low. Fenric stayed at the rear, the hammer resting against his shoulder, each step steady and deliberate. An hour passed before the two black shapes of the pillars rose ahead, just visible against the darkening sky. They stood in the same places they had that morning, stone jutting from the sand like old bones. The wind curled around them with a low, even hum. Berik slowed as they passed, his eyes on the weathered carvings along their bases. He did not stop. Rina's voice came quiet, almost lost to the air. Feels like another lifetime. Only Berik heard. It has been, he said. She glanced at him. For a moment, his voice was the same as it had been years ago, before the desert and the years between. Her expression shifted. Then she looked away. The rest of the walk passed in silence. By the time the vault's broken arch came into sight, the horizon was gone, and the first stars had taken its place. The threshold waited, cold stone catching the faint light. Berik stepped through first. The old glyph lines along the seam pulsed faintly, then stilled. Inside, the air was cool and dry. Their boots carried the grit of the day across the floor, the sound dull against the stone. Fenric set the hammer down against the wall and pulled the strap from his shoulder. Rina moved toward one of the larger blocks and sat, leaning forward on her elbows. Berik crossed to the table they had made from a low slab and began laying out the pieces he had taken from the dead. The brass tag, the map scrap, the faded cloth. The vault's walls held the quiet in place. The tension that had followed them from the fight eased, though it did not disappear. Berik sat at the slab, cross-legged, his attention fixed on the items he had taken from the fallen. He turned the brass tag over in his hand, running his thumb along the shallow etching. The map scrap lay open beside it, edges frayed and curling from the heat. The folded cloth was near the edge of the slab, its faded guild stamp just visible in the dim light. Fenric passed behind him without a word. He picked up the hammer, resting it across his shoulder, and started toward the corridor he had claimed. I'll be in my room, he said over his shoulder. His footsteps faded as he moved deeper into the vault. Rina stayed where she was, standing a few paces away. Her eyes moved between Berik's face and the objects on the slab. I don't think I ever thanked you for saving me. Berik looked away from the tag and met her gaze. You never needed to. Still, she said, her voice softer now. Thank you. He held her eyes for a moment longer before turning back to the map scrap. You're welcome, he said quietly. She started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. Do you mind if I ask something more of you? Berik set the tag down and glanced at her. Anything. I haven't slept in days. When I was the map thrall, I didn't sleep. Can I use your cot? Berik paused, then let out a small chuckle. Yeah, you can use it. If you need to sleep, I wouldn't mind sharing, like old times. If I need to, he said, already picking the tag back up. She nodded and made her way to the chamber he had been using. The space was simple, the bedding a pile of tarps and blankets pushed into the corner. She lowered herself onto it, curling into the rough fabric. The air was cool and still. For the first time since before the desert, she let her muscles loosen. The noise in her head was gone, replaced by the slow rhythm of her own breathing. She closed her eyes and slept,